We, the Center for Global Development, we're a group that try and see how we can make the international system that supports global development work more effectively.
How do we finance infrastructure in the poorest parts of the world? How do we increase productivity in agriculture? What kind of policy brings out the best outcomes?
What CGD is about is you can ask those difficult questions that people refuse to ask and actually find solutions.
We're thinking about how climate change will impact migration patterns, how that will in turn have impacts on people's health.
It's challenging to be able to align budget with ambitious programmatic goals, but it can be done.
If you can help to make things a little bit better, that's a good way to spend your time. Okay, good morning and welcome to the Center for Global Development. And for those of you who are following it in Washington, this is also the start of the week of the spring meetings of the IMF and the World Bank, which of course is one reason why such a distinguished group of panelists that I will turn to in a moment is here in Washington this week. And I just want to start by saying that I can't think of a better way for us to start this week than to have a panel that focuses on how the reform and evolution of the multilateral development banks, which is a big topic for the spring meetings this week, how that process is going to serve the needs of countries in Africa. Because as you all know, the big discussion right now is how do you get the multilateral development banks to play a bigger role in fighting global challenges, notably climate, but also pandemic, biodiversity, and how you do this in a way that doesn't detract from the role that they have to play in supporting the development agenda that countries have, the broader SDG agenda, and dealing with poverty. And nowhere is that issue going to come right up to the fore than in the work that they do in Africa, because it is African countries that are going to be the most impacted by climate change, where the needs for adaptation finance are multiples of any amount of financing that is currently on it being provided to countries in Africa to help them deal with climate impact, and where the needs for continuing to deal with poverty reduction and development are also going to be more and more concentrated for the next 10 years. So this is going to be an issue that has to be addressed up front, and I think it's particularly important to address this at a time when, if you look at the World Bank, which is the institution here based in Washington where we're going to have this conversation, if you look at the paper that they have just produced, looking at their own evolution, well, one very striking number in it is that unless something is done, the financing available to IDA, which is the concessional window of the World Bank, drops off by a third starting next year. And that's, how do you square that with the narrative about the increased need for financing, not just for dealing with development as they have been doing it, but to integrate more and more climate and other global challenges in it. So that is the topic, and I'm so glad that we have this distinguished panel of policymakers from Africa and also people from the private sector who work on Africa. And I'm very grateful to my colleague and friend Vera Songwe for having agreed to not just be an organizer and thinker about bringing together this panel, but also to moderate it. So with that, I'm going to get out of the way. I will turn it over to Vera, and I'm really looking forward to the conversation ahead. Thank you all for making the time.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Masood. I think that is proof now that all your microphones are on. Thank you, everybody, for joining this conversation today. I think, as Masood said again, this is really, for many of us, when we think about the spring meetings, we think about our ministers coming from the continent, and the question is always, you know, what is the ask? What is the answer? Are they going to go back happier? Are they going to go back feeling like they have been heard and having moved the dial? Of course, we have been living through so many crises now that, you know, crisis is the new normal. About a year ago or so, Secretary Yellen was here at CGD, and she kind of laid out this blueprint for what the MDBs and the multilateral development institutions should do. But I think one thing that I took away, and she'd made 2 or 3 at CIS and then here at CGD, one thing that she really kept sort of continuously talking about was the ambition. We must raise the ambition because the risk and the challenges are so much. So it is 1 year later, I'd like to ask the ministers, what is the ambition? What are they expecting? Of course, as Masood says, we all celebrated $93 billion of IDA 20 as the highest IDA ever. But immediately after we celebrated $93 billion of IDA used $37 billion, so $7 billion more than they were supposed to use in the first year because there was a crisis. So we are in almost a new normal, and we don't have enough resources going forward. So then the question is, what does ambition look like if you're pulling back resources? And I think that really is the conversation that we should be having as we go forward. But we'll hear from the ministers. I'm going to start with, on my left, immediate left, Minister Ken Ofori-Atta, the Minister of Finance and Economic Planning of the Republic of Ghana. Of course, when we hear Ghana, we hear a lot of things, Ken. We hear the fact that you have been in the news on many different issues. You went to China and you came back. And so not only are we talking about additional resources, but we're also talking about the big conversation in town on debt service servicing and how we do both the climate adaptation processes, but also manage our growth. So how do you see this spring meetings? What are your expectations? What are your ambitions? And what would you like the message to be to our IDA delegates?
Great. Thank you very much. And thanks for coming, spending time with us.
And I want to introduce the ministers as I ask them questions. Please. Thank you.
And this is one of the first meetings, so I guess it will signal the direction in which we are going to go. First of all, so we are about, 1.4 billion people. And the last SDR distribution, we got maybe 33 billion or so.
33.7.
7. Germany is about, 83 million people. And they might have got about 26 billion. So, you know, who needs it? And how is that going to be managed? So we're working on this hackneyed phrase of World Bank to eliminate poverty and have shared prosperity. So the question of Yellen's statement last October is what does this MDB reform mean? And I guess from what I'm illustrating, I'm suggesting that there has to be a way in which Africa gets a lot more capital than it is getting. And so what is being done with that? UN believes we need about 500 billion a year going forward. And our main entry or support from the bank essentially is IDA, as you have mentioned. And IDA has moved to the 93 billion, as you suggested. It looks like, if you look at the numbers, you see maybe 24 billion real contribution, and then the rest of it is either maybe capital markets and or mostly what we pay back in interest. So I then ask who is speaking for us in these reforms, what really is the structure of it going on, if most of these resources are going to be designed to meet this group, let's say Africa, which by 2050 would be a quarter of the world's population and most of the youth that is required. And I don't see the representation, and therefore I worry about the design that will happen. which happened with the DSSI or the G20 reforms. So I demur about that and worry whether we'll get to a solution that makes sense. Then we come to, therefore, the issue of quota representation in these activities, which is usually the economic power of the country, etc. But I think the issue of exposure should come in very strongly. Exposure in terms of population, poverty, etc. So that truly we'll be moving towards the issue of eliminating poverty and the shared prosperity that we talked about. I guess the other worry is we've begun to talk a lot more also about private sector engagement in there to bring resources. The question is, if you look at development partners' contributions to IDA, for example, anytime there's a possibility of alternative sources of resources, such as going to the capital markets, you see a cannibalization or a shrinking. So what is going to happen now, as we now fight to move into the trillions from the billions from the private sector, what are we actually looking to do? The climate change issues puts enormous pressure on us for a group of people that contributed much less to the situation. We are going to have to strand our resources to be able to get to 1.5 degrees, but there's no sense of a just transition that is paid for. So my question is, who is directing the reforms? And are we there strongly enough so that the design will not be wrong and we'll come back to the same place? So that's the question. And then a focus really on IDA to make sure that we increase our margin, as we've talked about, literally maybe triple, to be able to really take a stab at the problem that's ahead of us. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Ken. You raised a number of issues that I will come back to. One of them is quota, another one is the private sector, another one is the length of funding and the matching of funding with the projects that we're funding. And for that, I would like to go to the Minister of the National Treasury for Economic Planning of Kenya, a very good friend, and used to be a researcher, so he's done a lot of academic work on this stuff, and now he's on the implementation side. I feel for him sometimes. Minister Njuguna, really a pleasure to see you, and thank you for being here. One of the sort of issues that has been overlooked a lot is precisely this idea of infrastructure financing. There is almost repeatedly sometimes a misconception that all infrastructure financing can crowd in the private sector. And in addition to that, the idea that the funding that we're receiving is consistent with the cycle of project preparation. In the last 4 or 5 years, we've seen Kenya, you know, for those of us who have been to Nairobi 2 or 3 years ago, and now going to the airport, it doesn't take 3 more hours. But how have you seen, what has been the tension between trying to fund this kinds of important transformational infrastructure projects and the access to funding? So that's the first thing, is the tension. Yeah. How do you raise the resources to fund this? And Kenya has gone to the markets, the capital markets, quite an amount. Why do you go to the capital markets for this and not to the IDA, which is going to be a much cheaper funding? And what more could we do to help you reorganize your funding sources for this kinds of infrastructure projects?
Thank you very much, Vera, and nice to see you. I'm very happy to be here, coming back to see some old friends in CGD. Maybe I could start from a developmental concept of the role of infrastructure in countries, especially in developing countries, and especially in Africa, and more specifically even in Kenya. And one of the things that infrastructure financing does is actually to open up areas and even lower transactions cost. And this is Paul Collier's thesis that in Africa, private sector is transactions heavy. but if you lower transactions cost, you actually enhance the profitability of private investment. So infrastructure is very, very critical, it's very, very important. The whole idea is, how do you finance that infrastructure so that it can actually provide that complementary angle of private investments. For public investments, it drives private investments because it lowers transactions cost. And that is the most important aspect of this. And that's why it is very, very important that you raise finance for infrastructure and large-scale finance infrastructure. Kenya, for example, in the last 5 to 7 years, has really invested very heavily in terms of infrastructure, huge public investments. That's why going to the airport now will cost you just 10 to 11 minutes. But at what cost?
From 3 hours.
From 3 hours, yes. Of course, you can imagine how much, if you can cost your time, that is quite a large saving. But the whole issue is, how do you finance that? That, for example, is financed by PPP. And we can actually say, maybe it's better because it's budget and debt neutral, which is very, very important. But then, what about those others that cannot be financed in the same way? That is, they have an impact on budget and they have an impact on debt. So you realize that it becomes quite problematic. Right now, Kenya is facing one of the, maybe, should I say, difficult situations, because on one extreme, there is financing constraints, and on the other, there is no headroom for debt. So it means that we have to rely on PPP. But let me go back to financing infrastructure. One of the biggest problems that we face is that the returns, the high cost of borrowing, especially look at the Eurobond, for example, the international capital markets, it's going to be very difficult for you for a country like Kenya to borrow in the international capital markets to finance public investments. In fact, it is impossible. The spreads are too huge. And you are financing public investment or a public good, which again, its valuation and even how people value it is going to be quite problematic. So in a sense, given those kind of interest rates or spreads, it's impossible for you to finance infrastructure. Then it means that you cannot actually open up the economy and everything that goes with it, then it means it's quite problematic. So you can imagine that kind of situation. So that's why we come back to saying who can be the savior, and that's why we come back to MDBs, multilateral development banks or institutions in terms of what kind of reforms do we require so that they can actually be the gatekeepers in terms of how you can roll out such infrastructure, such huge infrastructure projects. For me, that is very, very important because that's the only chance for us to open up the economy. That's the only chance for us to have that convergence of encouraging private sector and also providing development opportunities. And then it means that we have to go back and ask, what kind of reforms do we require for us to unlock that kind of long-term finance? Because that is where the constraints are. I do believe that this is the area that is becoming very, very problematic. And this is an area that we need to look at. And you can also link that to what is happening to climate change. Why is it that if we look at the Horn of Africa, for example, most of the countries have found themselves to the right of 1.5 degrees in terms of climate change. So it means that the future is even disastrous. Now, the next thing is to say, given the kind of catastrophe we have, it means that we have reversed the last possibly more than 20 years of efforts of poverty reduction and inequality. And even right now, what has come in is also social conflict because of competing for natural resources. But there are infrastructure projects that can be developed. For example, water dams resources, they are part of the infrastructure. So in a sense, we are actually moving not only from what we see at in our urban centers, but even going into some remote areas to see we can construct water dams and even water management systems that can actually help in terms of irrigation. They become part of the infrastructure projects that should be undertaken. So you can see that it moves further, not only from purely urban centers, but also into the rural sectors in terms of that. The whole issue is how do we finance them in the future, because we cannot rely on private international capital markets.
Thank you so much. I want to go now to Minister Samuel Tway. the minister from Liberia. And two issues I wanted to raise with you. The first one is a lot of times when we talk about IDA and multilateral development, additional resources, one of the things that comes from the other side is the absorptive capacity. And I'd just like to get a little bit of your sense of what is it that we can do more to in terms of instruments. Where do you see Liberia, for example, being able to absorb the fastest amount of IDA, if more IDA were to be available? We're all talking about increasing the size of IDA, but if that were to happen today, where would you allocate that? Secondly, Liberia, of course, is a small low-income economy, which is suffering the plight of climate change. And I think in the report that I had the honor of writing with Nick Stern and Amma Bhattacharya, we say that we should not use debt resources to fight climate. We need to find additional concessional resources. How are you managing the climate challenge today, and what more would you expect the MDB reform conversation to do to support you?
Thank you very much, Vera, for the opportunity. Important questions there, but I would like to go first to why we're here and the context that is important. In the last 75 years, we've made the argument about multilateral reform. Somebody has not heard that argument. And the question is, why in 75 years you've made the argument and you're trying to make it in the next 30 years? Maybe nobody will hear. Maybe the context in which we're making the argument is not being pressed enough. We're making it in the context of, either increases, small reforms. I say no, let's step back. Let's go back to the foundation of Bretton Woods. This is multilateral fundamentalism. In 1945, we established the United Nations, the World Bank and the IMF. Why? Because we did not want another Adolf Hitler. And we did not want global wars. So we launched a phase where we strengthened democracy and we entered the Cold War. That was then. 75 years after that, not even 75, 44 years after that, in 1989, the Berlin Wall fell and communism collapsed. In those 44 years, China lifted 600 million people out of poverty. China was the last reserve of a communist country. In those same years, Africa put millions of people into poverty. You're standing at 1989, China lifting people out of poverty, and Africa having more people in poverty. Beyond 1989 to now, China moved more people out of poverty. South Korea received $2.5 billion, which the World Bank gave to all countries in 1950. That funding enabled South Korea to become an economic miracle. Africa has never been treated as a geostrategic interest for the global multilateral system. So when you come to your question of capacity, business environment, then we look at Africa. Oh, the capacity is weak. They don't have he was talking about infrastructure. McKinsey wrote a report that says there are two issues with infrastructure in Africa. They need more money, but then there is the money where only 10% of the funding reaches financial close. So you don't have more money, but of the money you're having, 10% of the infrastructure projects are reaching financial close. Who's solving that problem? That's why we set up the International Finance Corporation and the World Bank to deal with those big challenges. Do you know that the World Bank before 1960 was involved only with large infrastructure projects? It shifted to social sector since then. Was that change necessary? Or do we go back to the old World Bank? The question is, to answer these questions, you have to look at this broader context. Because as we speak right now, Africa needs $2.4 trillion between 2010 and 2020 and 2030 for climate finance. You were talking about IDA of 93 million. Now put that scale together. IDA 93 million, 2.4 trillion. Africa needs 100 billion to close the infrastructure gap. So you have to present to the G7 and to the multilateral community that the reforms we're talking about are not sclerotic small pieces. We have to go back to 1945. Africa, the Cold War that we succeeded in, right, the Soviet Union collapse, came at the expense of Africa. That is what the G7 has to believe, that we paid the price. Between 1945 and now, the West destroyed the climate And Africa is needing $2.5 trillion to restore itself. Look at that inequity and that imbalance. When you present the argument in that way, then people say, well, we go back to the foundation of multilateral fundamentalism. Then increasing IDA becomes a matter of urgency. And so the context is important as the argument of how we reform the bank rules, ending poverty and sharing prosperity. How do you end poverty? Do you end poverty by the bank going to do social protection? Or do you end poverty by closing the infrastructure gap so that companies can move and provide jobs for people in Africa? It's a strategy. Which strategy are you pursuing? That has to be at the bottom line of rethinking the whole system. Other than that, we have tactical gains as we've had. Either we'll move from 93, it'll go 20%, 30% up. That's a tactical gain. What you need is a strategic, geoeconomic, geostrategic approach to look at this. Now, coming specifically to your question about capacity, yes. The argument is that do countries have the absorptive capacity? That's a legitimate argument. But what do we do to enable countries to get the absorptive capacity? So I just made an example of a McKinsey study. They're saying countries cannot absorb the infrastructure flows because projects are failing. They can't do bankable projects. They're not able to pipeline. So that's the big problem there. They're losing 80%. How do we sit with countries to achieve that? That's why we have a private sector win at the World Bank. That's why we have IFC. What is IFC doing along with the bank to resolve the capacity issues? All right? So countries will continue to struggle. The excuse will be, well, they don't have the absorptive capacity. Either, in my constituency in the World Bank, for example, I think we have around 25 billion of unspent IDA, even though all countries need more money. We're looking for more IDA resources, and countries are not moving, are not disbursing enough. What is the reason? Some of it is bank rule, some of it is country rule. Let's bring that to this holistic table and have the conversation. Liberia is a green economy. Liberia has received no support from the international community for its greenness. How can we be serious? So right now, the other day, the president encouraged us to sign into a 50 billion pact with the UAE. UAE is establishing a 50 billion fund. They said, look, you are too green. We want to do our development. We want to leverage your greenness, and so we want to pipeline some projects so that at least we'll be able to give you 500 million or 1 billion to do your infrastructure, because the West has already developed, and maybe UAE wants to go to the West, so they will pollute, and we will help them pollute because we have the forest. That is the conversation of the Paris conversation. But where are we going with that? So, Farah, this is an exciting, interesting conversation to have here at the margins of the World Bank. But I think we have to be serious in the debate. If we do it a piecemeal way every year, we talk small talk, we get small increases in IDA. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. That's well said. I think you're meeting with the two previous ministers before you who wanted a tripling of IDA. Let me go to my very good friend and sister, Minister Vera Esperanza dos Santos Davis de Souza. We have the same name. The Minister of Finance of Angola is doing amazing things out there. Minister Vera, I have two questions for you. One of them is around when Secretary Yellen spoke. She also spoke about the need to do more regional projects and the fact that to be able to get some of the benefits of the infrastructure investments, we will need to be able to then bring together more countries to do some of these projects that hitherto have been unbankable or unfinishable. Angola has done, first of all, and I'll start with that, give us a little bit of a sense of how well you have done with the support of the MDB and what more you need in terms of resources to go forward, despite the crises that we have seen and witnessed on the continent. And then secondly, by way of infrastructure financing in particular, we have seen many visits from particularly the West into DRC, Zambia, and Angola, looking for different kinds of minerals. But we haven't yet seen a construction of an integrated infrastructure platform. Angola has created a railroad. You have funded it mostly with your own resources. How do you see us doing this kinds of big infrastructure going forward? Is it still by own country financing? Is it a mix of funding? What, in your opinion, would you like the MDBs to hear from you in that perspective?
Thank you. Thank you very much, Vera. Thank you, CGD. Thank you, Masood, for this opportunity. It's a pleasure to be here to listen from my colleagues. Well, first of all, I think it's a journey. We did some interesting things with the support of MDBs, by ourselves, with support of bilateral institutions, with export credit agency, warranties. We did a mix of things to move forward and put in place some infrastructures. But as my colleagues from Liberia mentioned, the gap is huge. And we need a lot more in two perspectives. Not only much more funding in concessional terms, and also more financial instruments that help to mobilize more private funding, go together MDBs and the private sector to allow the countries to get access to the funding coming from the private sector, but not so expensive, I think is something that we need. Not only, also, of course, for either countries, but also for middle income countries with fragile social condition, where Angola is included. But we need also to rethink the operational process of the MDBs. And once again, my colleagues from Liberia mentioned it. What we need to do better to disburse faster, to make sure that the know-how stay internally, that we depend less on consultants, that we are not always struggling about the difference in between salaries among those consultants, that we are able to move with a procurement process without a headache, that we are aligned in terms of the procurement process, that we speed up the environmental ritual of getting the approval. So, but for that to happen, we need to look inside both parts. The MDBs, we need to look internally to see if the internal procedures are right, and if they are structured in a way that the technology and the capacity building is coming out of the paper and it's really staying at the country that are getting benefits of the funds. Because so much important as getting access to more money is to get the good use of that money, to make sure that that money adds value to the country and to the local people, financial accountants, lawyers, can be part of this. Of course, the infrastructure is good, but we need talking about Angola, we need the Angolan people to be part of the maintenance, to be part of the legal advisory process, to be part of the financial advisory process. What we can do more to take a good use of that money. So it's something that is an important part of the reform that I think we are not moving so fast that we should. And also the risk management and the risk perception is also something that we need to discuss. Of course, some MDBs are more open than others about this risk discussion. But I think that this refrains some MDBs to do more for Africa. I think the continent is huge. The potential is always there. Everything, good and bad, need to be multiplied for its dimension. So it's better to be good things happening at Africa as compared to bad things if we consider this multiplication formula. So what we should do, how MDBs could support us to do more, how the MDBs should transform themselves to do more. Because we cannot sit up on top of a lower performance and do nothing. We need to do more together. So I defend the process of mobilizing funds, the process of engaging the private sector, the process of using more financial innovation to leverage the funding mobilization, but I think that so much important than this is to move forward reshaping the operational process and the process of take the good advantage of that money. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Minister Vera, for that. I think really also honest assessment of the operational part of the resources. Yes, it's one thing to ask for a lot more resources. Another thing, and very happy on both sides to see how we can do better. I will come back in terms of instruments to Minister Ken on guarantees and Minister Juguna on what other kinds of instruments we can do and do differently to make sure that this disbursement, which is a sticky and painful issue in the institution, can change. I think today we have disbursement ratios, as you said, of 20, 25%. This is not for lack of trying. I can attest that there has been hard work and a lot of push to see how we can do faster disbursements in the MDBs. It goes up, it comes back down, it goes up. What can we do to sustain it, and are there different instruments that can be used to do that? We see that in times of crisis, of course, we absorb 37 billion immediately, so something is happening there that makes it happen, and maybe we should then institutionalize those processes that we only use in times of crisis. I want to come to you, Jay. Jay Collins is the Vice Chairman of Banking, Capital Markets and Advisory Group at Citi Group. Jay is a friend of climate. Everywhere there's a climate discussion he goes, he is a friend of the continent as well. But Jay is here a little bit representing the tooth fairy, right? As we all know, $13 trillion in the capital markets. The private sector is going to deliver it tomorrow morning. You just need to do a few things, and then it'll all come. And
I've never been called a tooth fairy before.
and we've been trying for so long to get from billions to trillions, and always believing that we will get to that leverage capacity that will deliver it for us, and just not getting there. The World Bank now has working on getting a new president. Ajay Banga was just here at CGD last week as well, where he talked a little bit about MDB reform, exactly what we're talking about, what needs to be done, how can one. He's coming from the private sector, so he knows how difficult it is to get private capital. He knows that private capital comes with shareholders and a different set of requirements. How do we make that private capital come to the continent at scale and consistently? What we see, for example, in climate finance, we talk so much about it, but only 1% of climate finance resources actually come to the continent in equity form. About 4% maybe come in some loans and some conversation. But even when you do a green bond on the continent, today it's much more onerous as a Minister of Finance of an African country to do a green bond than to just do a plain vanilla bond because of all the additional fiduciary harmonization and SEC requirements that are needed for that. How do you, first of all, two questions. Do you believe that private capital we can leverage on a scale of 1 to 5 or 1 to 4? What is needed for us to get there? Why haven't we gotten there so far? And secondly, as the private sector speaking to our African finance ministers who are looking for additional resources, who are looking for concessional financing, what is stopping you, the private sector, from leveraging the concessional resources enough to be able to come and crowd in more financing to the continent?
Thank you, Vera. Let me try and break that down. And I think I would start with your first question, with do I believe that that's possible? And it's only possible if we break glass, because we're not getting this right. And as Minister Vera said, you measure, if you measure something, you will drive toward that conclusion. And fundamental, the MDB framework is set up to measure what we lend. We measure what we lend. How many of you believe we should measure what we mobilize, meaning that the total amount of capital is what's key? That you've got to, we should say, like, how much do you mobilize? Because then, as you were saying, organizational principles, you have to start with, if I measure mobilization and I say whether that number is a 4 times multiple or a 5 times multiple, that the entire construct of these organizations is not people in the trenches trying to lend more, but trying to mobilize more and design for that purpose. Because then, Vera, I would be optimistic. With Ajay's leadership, his understanding, and others like Secretary Yellen that are committed to do things differently. So how do you get there? Let me just give you 3 or 4 of the key components, importantly, the ones that I believe Africa has to pound the table for. First is the programmatic construct. And if you want to mobilize the private sector, we have to have the MDBs help enable the environment. In the JET-P process in the environment space, we talk about an enabling environment reform that allows for the investments to flow. And really dig in deeply to what is preventing the private sector from investing. One of the things that we will see is that everyone talks about bankable projects. Well, we're nowhere near bankable projects. We don't have the pipeline of the feasibility studies of the concept to operationalization of infrastructure projects. We don't have enough of those done. And shame on the MDBs and the institutions that really haven't helped Africa and others in the world to create those projects. So if you want the private sector to come and you show the private sector, if I show my bankers, a project finance banker, a 1-page concept paper from some of the countries here, they don't know what to do with that. They want the link to the data room that has hundreds of pages of project finance documentation, of feasibility studies of how to operationalize that project, and then we'll build a financial model. And then we'll tell you with the MDBs how to fund it. So there's an awful lot that can be done to enable the environment to have project centricity. But we have to tell those institutions that they have to be measured to create more. Now, I believe, and Stephanie von Freeburg, who's joined Citi from after 30 years in the World Bank Group, and I've just written a paper saying if we're going to actually mobilize the private sector, the MDBs have to create products and tools that mobilize us. And that means mitigating risk in ways that they haven't done up until now. And one of the things Vera just asked is, why isn't that just happening naturally? Why is it that the private sector isn't just taking that risk on their own? Well, after the financial crisis, the regulatory construct changed, and it changed radically, and it made it exceedingly difficult, if not impossible, for global universal banks to take single B, double B risk, whether it's a country, whether it's a project. We created a paradigm so that banks can't fail, so that the big banks won't fail. So we're going to now say, well, push them in without mitigating that risk. Well, that won't happen. It won't happen with Solvency II and the insurance companies. It won't happen with global pension funds with fiduciary responsibilities, and it won't happen with the banks unless their risk is mitigated. So probably the most technical exercise, and this is what our paper is about, that has to happen is to design the tools and the products for purpose. I'll throw out handfuls, but literally everything from taking junior tranches in structures that absorb more risk, to B bonds, to what we call true ups or make whole provisions, structural subordination. I could go on, and I'm probably speaking Greek to most of you. So let's just say that, imagine that the structures for project finance and structures in lending absorbed enough risk surgically, specifically to country risk, to FX risk, to long duration risk, absorbed enough risk to get the returns such that this tooth fairy, this pot of gold of this $130 to $160 trillion of investment grade, low risk taking capital could actually flow. We haven't designed those tools. We looked at every one of the tools that the MDBs had, and you know what we found? that even when they're designed, like guarantees, PRI, PRG, they actually have poor regulatory capital treatment. Those tools were never designed to where actually, if you took that, as a bank, I could have my regulatory capital treated in a way that makes that efficient. Well, why not? Why aren't we in a room redesigning those tools so that they work, so that the capital treatment is such that it crowds in the private sector into Africa and the emerging markets? And that is the opportunity. If we don't do that, then we're nowhere near the public sector with the fiscal burdens now. It's just, there's no chance either for global public goods or the environmental crisis that we're facing or the recoveries from COVID, energy, food crisis. There's no way it can do it alone. It can only do it with the private sector. So this should be mission critical.
Thank you so much, Jay. I mean, I think you couldn't be clearer. So it's two things. The fantastic news is that you're in the room. And so essentially, we don't need to look too far. You continuously mention the IFC, and I think maybe at on the World Bank side and in the sort of more standard multilateral development institutions, we don't measure leverage and mobilization. But I think at the IFC we do measure mobilization. And maybe we need to come back and see whether we do it more or differently. But there already is, I think, a little bit of a tradition there that maybe we could certainly try to see how we build on to get. And you're right, what you do not measure, you can never know whether you're succeeding in. So we do need to measure it, and we certainly do need to bring you in the room to see how we fix the tools, because there is an army out there, as you know, and as Stephanie has herself been doing, trying to see how we make the tools acceptable to market participants like yourself. But if we are sort of always running behind you because regulation is changing, then we have to figure out a way of running together so we can actually, in effect, raise the resources. On climate, I want to come back to you just before I come back to the ministers. You have been supporting a lot of the climate COP28 work. What do you see as the impediment for more green financing from the private sector into the continent?
Well, first of all, I do believe, as many say,
and Minister Toure said he's going to the UAE.
Yes.
Is there something we can do with the MDBs so that before he goes to the UAE, we get, or maybe together, we can bring the UAE and himself?
But compete with MDBs.
No. It's the same goal. Yeah, so maybe you could come in and do more, and we can do much faster and leverage what is happening.
So I would say a couple of things. One is, I am a believer in Secretary Kerry's paradigm that, that you can pick 20 countries with the largest emissions in the world, and they're 80% of the problem. And so at a certain point, when you tell Africa that you're 4% of the problem, and you've got to do the same things before you develop that the highest emitters in the world are doing, I'm struggling with the pressure that's being put on Africa at a time when critical investments aren't being made. But I also see it as an opportunity, because I think that the hard-to-abate sectors in the world are going to move to where energy is cheap and where the sun shines and the wind blows, and this is an enormous opportunity to leapfrog if we can just crowd in that investment. So rather than resisting it, I think we need to do a couple things. One is that we need to take adaptation seriously, and in the MDB reform, we're going to have to understand that if we don't start funding adaptation, we have SLR and drought. We have fundamental climate issues that will tip the risk tipping point so far, Vera, that then you can't recover. Yeah. Second is you can't accomplish energy transition without transmission. And transmission is a massive problem. We can develop a solar or wind farm project and implement it very fast, but we're seeing that there are 3, 5, 7-year delays in the entire grid and transmission process. And Africa fundamentally is going to have the MDBs and the global players start to invest much more energy and focus in projects around transmission, because otherwise you're going to be stuck. A lot of players that I know are looking at projects right now and saying, well, the generation, that's easy, but we never invested the time and energy. And so that's something that the UAE or the COP28 team is thinking about. One of what I've told the COP28 team was just in the UAE, saying, you have something others haven't had, and that is a lot of governments don't have trained investment bankers that can actually structure deals, but you have more sovereign wealth funds. And you have sovereign wealth funds that are, remember, sovereign wealth funds tended to, in energy producing countries, they were the store of wealth for the country, but they didn't double down in oil and gas. They invested away from that, actually, to protect the country. So they have invested heavily in the know-how in the new green world. And the reason that's important to Africa is we have to not just have the MDBs, but we should be pushing the sovereign wealth funds to design and help us structure projects and to take risk alongside the governments that back those sovereign wealth funds into a lot of projects to help us accelerate the pace of all of this.
Thank you.
And to crowd in capital that the sovereign wealth funds have. I mean, at this point, they are the biggest asset space of the sovereign community that wants to transition.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And Kenya is already doing a lot of work in pooling sovereign wealth funds, but we'll maybe get some questions and then come back to what Kenya is doing on that front. I will open up. Are there any questions? I don't know if there's somebody that is taking questions or there's a mic that is moving around.
There's the mic.
And there is a question there. Keep your questions, there's one. So there's two. Minister.
Thank you very much, Dr. Vera, for giving me the floor. I would like to say congratulations to the panelists, as they have raised a very critical aspect that we need to consider at this particular moment. My question is, I'm from African Union, the Peace Fund Secretariat. And as we are about to operationalize the Peace Fund, you were discussing about how we're going to get complements or resources to be able to make sure that development is going to be carried out. The precondition for enhancing development is making sure that we have peace in the continent. As Excellency Ministers, you know it well, as it has been decided by the head of states, we are about to raise the 400 million, which is going to be a siege resource to make sure that conflict prevention is going to be exercised. But to be able to make sure that we are going to work aggressively on the prevention aspect, the seed money that we're going to attain as of this budget year is not going to be good enough. How do you see the engagement of multilateral organizations to support this basic activity beyond environment, beyond any other aspects that we share as enabling factor for the developmental endeavors that we want to see, and make sure that the continent of our people are going to benefit out of that? Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you. I think there was a question behind. Okay.
Thank you. My name is Emmanuel. Just want to ask a generic question for all of the wonderful finance ministers we have here today. What are you borrowing for from MDBs? Is it to address short-term macroeconomic fragility or the long run? What are you borrowing for? To mitigate the high cost of fertilizer, fuel, and food that is being produced from probably Ukraine as a result of the war in Ukraine. What we must understand is that the war in Ukraine has exposed the entrenched vulnerability of African countries. So are you borrowing to subsidize the high cost of fuel, or are you borrowing to maybe build a manufacturing plant that will produce fertilizer within the region. What are you actually borrowing for?
Thank you so much. I think we get the question. I think there was one here, and then I'll take one last one, and then we'll go back to the ministers.
Hello, I guess our representative from Liberia was talking about the need of Africa and his country. As an engineer, I've seen like cities develop so much infrastructure that it became obsolete and hard to live in the city, that traffic doesn't move. You're talking about like the distribution of energy. How do we need like a huge countrywide infrastructure if we can do like some localized projects? One thing that we have to think is the future. For example, concrete was invented by the ancient Romans, and we still use concrete as the basis of transportation and habitation. How can we, instead of saying we need to reproduce the infrastructure of the West in Africa, we can use some cities as like to develop like new technologies that will become, the cities of the future.
Thank you very much. I'm going to go a very short, quick sort of fire starter answers and anything else that you want to say. I know that Masood, you were not supposed to say something, but I'm going to call you up to sort of do a last closing. But I'll start with you, Ken, very quickly. One or two things. You've heard all the conversation. You've heard the private sector and the raising of resources and the difficulties. What are two things that you would like to leave on the MDB reform conversation if, again, our delegates are to listen to you after this conversation? What do you want to tell them, and where should we be going? And the same question to all of you.
Thank you very much. I'll just try and, I think, Manuel, about what we are borrowing for. And it's a big debate in Ghana as to how we got to this level. And partly because we all have pretty short memories. And somehow we acknowledge the cataclysmic nature of COVID-19, the war, the change in prices, and therefore when we invested from 2017 through now, in which we doubled growth, etc., and had about 1 million more people in schools, and COVID-19, we had about 1,400 people dying as opposed to 280,000 in Africa. We suddenly forget that the investment trajectory is much longer than 2-3 years. So that before you could begin to realize and those benefits, we've had these polycrises that have affected, and we are in this situation, and prices have changed, etc. But then, so coming back to some of what my colleagues have said, especially on the issue of private sector engagement, it's whether during these NDB discussions, one can also put debt forgiveness into the discussion. One can look at a Brady Plan type outlook in which new SDRs may be used as a wraparound to be able to then pay much less than we are paying. One should look at the financing of the IMF or IDA to realize that African contributions are truly maybe a majority of what has been used for operational purposes, etc. And unfortunately, we don't sit at the table for the designs. So the issue of new SDRs to act as a wraparound to be able to support what Jay is saying, so that we reduce the risk in their mind for it, for us then to create all of those instruments that they can participate in. But also on our side, the shame of Ukraine was a discovery of how important they are with regards to grains. And therefore, what we as African finance ministers would invest in agriculture and digitalization as key interventions to move towards climate change.
Thank you. I'm going to go to Vera. Minister Vera, you want to come in?
Yes, yes. Thank you, Vera.
You have 30 seconds. Yes, I'll come back to you.
First of all, just to quickly answer the question, we used to borrow for increase the access of the Angolan people to electricity and water, to increase also the infrastructure and education and health, also the quality of the services on that side, to increase productivity in agriculture and social safety net. That's the main priorities. About, like I resume, I think we should keep being more demanding about MDBs and the reforms that need to be done within the MDBs. As I mentioned, not only regarding the mobilization of funding, more money being available to put, being available to African countries, but also how the MDB can use their own instruments to attract more funding from the private sector and the operational side of the process.
Thank you.
But
thank you.
also being demanding about ourselves, just to finish, Vera, about some values that we need to pursue. Patriotism, meritocracy, integrity, doing our best to have dignity, to demand even more.
Development with dignity, Minister Jiguna.
Just a quick point. I hear so much every time about the bankability of projects, and especially infrastructure projects. And since you started with the expressway, for example, in Nairobi from the airport, just see that was designed and thought about in the 60s. 60 years down the line, everybody would talk about bankability. And with that, we connect with the risk rating. It's like a conspiracy theory. It brings you down every time. So we have to rethink about this bankability of projects as well as the risk that we want to attach. Something that we really need to think, because if it's working after private sector of providing it, and nobody is complaining about the price you pay, then something was wrong all the years, 60 years down the line. So we have to go back and start thinking, what is this bankability as well as the risk rating? It's like a conspiracy theory. Sorry.
Dignity, conspiracy, development. Minister Tuey, last word, please.
Bankability is a serious problem. We have to deal with it. Yeah. To answer Emmanuel's question and to summarize some of the key points he was making, we're stuck with a model. It's like a car and an airplane. Sometimes I think, what if you clear the entire space? Can a car speed at the rate of 1,000 miles per hour like an airplane? The answer is no, because it's a car. It cannot move, barring obstacles. It cannot move as fast as a plane just because
30 seconds,
it's a model. So let's reform the model of the MDBs, making the MDBs do the things that will crowd in the private sector. If you don't do that, you come back here every day and have the conversation. Let's change the model. Let's move from a car to an airplane.
Fantastic. It's a fantastic way to end. I'm going to call Masood to come and close the conversation. Jay, you and I had 2 or 3 back and forth, so...
Well, I will just say 2 things, Vera, since you've asked me to do this. One thing that I took away from this panel is that you can't do this MDB reform without stepping back a bit and looking strategically at what it is that we're trying to achieve. Incremental tinkering will do small good things, but it's not going to solve the problem. Second big takeaway, I think, is that there's as much to be done in thinking about how we operate, how they look, their business model, whether it's the right instruments for reaching out to the private sector, whether it's the way in which, Vera, you were raising. I think that part is not getting as much focus so far in the conversation. And I think this week is really the opportunity for all of you as participants in those official meetings to put these points and the other points you've raised squarely into that official discussion, because we're not going to close this MDB reform work this week. It's going to run from now at least through October, maybe longer. And I think this is the moment to inject those thoughts into that process. So thank you all very much again for making the time, and thank you, Vera, for doing this.